Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Superintendent's Conference Day. We're about to get started. Our session this morning is for our special education teachers here in the Rochester City School District. We are glad to have you with us this morning. Today's session is the third and final installment of our Data-Driven IEP development series that we've been working through for the last 2 school years. I want to tell you a little bit about this series before we get started. As a recap, last year, we started with data-driven present levels of performance in the IEP. This fall, we moved into looking at our measurable annual goals. And today's session will focus a lot on supplemental aids and services, which include our program accommodations, our testing accommodations, special transportation, and other pieces of that section of the IEP. Wanted to make sure that before we start, I let you know that our session has been tailored to the needs of our district and also taken into account some of the communication, guidance, and feedback that we've received from NYSED's Office of Special Education Quality Assurance team. So we're going to spend some time talking about that and then move into the second piece of the PD where we'll dive more into those supplemental aids and accommodations on the IEP and how we can link those to the data in our present levels. Before we get started, I do want to introduce your presenters for today. So we have a wonderful team here, and I'm going to start off with letting you know about Shannon Markin. Shannon is one of our Associate Directors of Special Education, who you might know from your school, but she also has a significant focus on our professional development and instruction here in the district. We have Shannon D'Agostino. Shannon is a teacher coordinator of special education and also has a significant focus on instruction, IEP development, and professional development. And we have Eugene McNamara, who is an associate director of special education compliance, works closely with our schools on our corrective action plans and other compliance related items in our IEPs. I am going to turn it over to Shannon, who's going to go through our agenda for this morning.
Hello. So today we're going to start off with some feedback from CEQA, and Jean is going to be delivering that message. You will see the rest of our agenda, but first we're going to turn it over to Jean.
Good morning, everyone. Gene McNamara here. Thank you for having me. I want to start off with doing a quick review from state education, to kind of give you an idea of where we are compliant-wise and what we'll be going through with today's presentation. So as many of you may know, last year, the CEQA, which is the Special Education Quality Assurance Team, came into the district and worked with many of the schools doing a technical assistance for our IEP writing. As part of that technical assistance, it went into a state review, which we had to submit documentation to the state that they could review the IEPs. And from that, we ended up then by the end of the year with a corrective action plan. Based on the 30 plus IEPs that we submitted, we had to do some corrective changes to them. We had to align the different pieces of the IEP to meet compliance. We did several submissions before we got a little bit more clarity from the state as to what we needed to really focus on and fix. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start us off today with going over the areas that were identified by CEQA as needing immediate action and immediate attention. Many of you have already been working with us to make those changes to the IEP. Many of you have been attending presentations where I've come out to the building to go over some of the alignments. And today I'm going to do a brief overview of that alignment. When I come out to your buildings, I'll go into more in depth, but then from the presentation, it will move to Shannon. Shannon and Amy will be going into details of how to bring the information into the IEPs to keep them compliant. So to start, the state said that our present levels of performance were not aligning to our goals. And what we ended up determining with them is that they were stating we did not have current data or baseline data that connected to the goals. The second piece that they mentioned to us was that our academic and our management needs sections also did not align with our present level descriptions and did not align with our goals. The third area that they looked at was actually the goals themselves not aligning to the present level data that we had or to the needs, and that many of our goals were not measurable or observable. And so I will go through some of that alignment today, but the actual focus of the goals not being measurable, observable, that'll be part of a major piece of today's presentation. The fourth part that the state looked at was our supplemental aids and program modifications and accommodations. And again, they were saying that the information that we had there did not align with the information that we wrote above in the present levels or within the management needs and our academic needs. And lastly was a section that they wanted us to pay close attention to, which is the effect of the student's needs and how that impacts the student in the general ed curriculum. So I'm going to go over each one of these, giving you some basic alignment, and then we'll move into the rest of the day's training. Next slide, Jen. So this brings us to our learning objectives, and it starts off with understanding that you're going to be able to understand the difference between a non-compliant and a compliant and a quality IEP, that you will be able to construct an evidence-based IEP in which the present levels of performance justify those needs and that they align. And then you will also be able to show that you can align all of the different parts throughout the entire IEP to those statements above. So to get started, I want to give you some of the ways that CEQA is looking at our corrective action plan, how they went through the IEPs and what they were looking for with the alignment. Next slide. So what I did here was I just took a brief present level of performance for reading. And again, the present levels are not all encumbersome. It doesn't have all of the information that would go in there, but I wanted to show you the alignment and the specific areas that the state is looking at. So this slide is showing the alignment of the present levels to the student's needs. And I'm going to read through this and I'll point out some specifics as I go. So according to Alex's teachers, when reading a grade level narrative text with scaffolding, he is able to identify a theme or a central idea and identify text evidence to support his response in 3 out of 4 opportunities. What you see there is that 3 out of 4 opportunities that's highlighted is one way of documenting baseline data or current data that a student is doing with a skill. It's not the only way, and you'll see that as we go through. The next statement in blue is he takes a little longer to process ideas than his peers. He is unable to explain how the text evidence contributes to the development of the theme. Now, the reason I put this part in here is that we are able to make statements that are broad statements that don't necessarily have data collected on them in the present levels. But this is a critical piece that talks about the student taking longer to process ideas than his peers. And that's going to come into play later on when we start looking at some of the supplemental needs. Alex is able to answer right there questions when reading a grade level text 60% of the time. This is the second opportunity where I'm showing that you can collect data through trials, through opportunities, or through percentages. He is able to answer evaluative or application questions independently with 50% accuracy. Alex struggles with answering high-level comprehension questions that require making inferences and predictions from the text, from the content area text. Now, the reason I highlighted this piece is that a lot of times we find in our present levels that we just make a statement like the student struggles with comprehension questions, but we don't explain what that struggle is or what type of comprehension questions they struggle with. So in this case, if you look, it says making inferences and predictions. That's what we want to do when we make broader statements of struggles, has a hard time with, is unable to do something. We want to describe that piece of what they're struggling with. So Alex takes longer to formulate ideas and struggles to complete his writing when more than 2 paragraphs are requested. Again, giving specifics of 2 paragraphs are requested, that's where he struggles with his writing. He has shown marked improvement in completing writing assignments when he uses a graphic organizer, breaking the task out into sections. Again, this is key when we talk about looking later on at our at our supplemental aids. And if we use a graphic organizer in the supplemental aids, we have to be able to relate it back up to the present levels. And we have to show that actually there's been some success with this for the student. The next piece here in yellow is when reading a grade level text, Alex is able to answer inferential questions independently with 50% accuracy. That is actually the data that we're using for the goal that on the next slide I'll show you. We have the percentage in there. We say what it is that he has trouble answering, and it is related to, again, the reading pieces that we're talking here. This next blue section are broader statements, but they're very specific, again, to the supplemental aids. Alex is highly distractible and goes off task frequently. He responds well when redirected by the teacher with nonverbal and subtle verbal cues, asking him a question about the task. When multiple directions are given, Alex will become confused and need checks for understanding. He does better answering questions out loud when he is given a heads up that the teacher will be calling on him. And when Alex is provided with extra time to answer questions out loud, he is more likely to comply. Now, again, these blue sections are going to be added into our supplemental aids later on. Excuse me. Okay, next slide, please. Right. If you could back up one, there we go. Okay, the next piece is that the state was looking at is the alignment of those present levels that I just went over to the student's needs. And when we look at the IEP, there are under each one of the different areas of the academics, we have a section that would say academic development and functional needs of the student, including consideration of the student's needs that are of concern to the parent. And then there's also a management needs section as well, which is the nature, type, and degree and extent to which environmental and/or human material resources are needed to address needs identified above. Now, the colored coordination I did here was just to show you that up above, we already identified some of these academic needs, but we don't have to restate the exact information from the present level above. We have to indicate what are we going to be working on or what does the student need. So in this case, it's a statement that says that Alex needs to improve his ability to predict and make inferences from the text. We also add in here his need of, it needs to improve reading comprehension, because that was an area above that we also talked about. There are other pieces in here about working on getting his ideas down when he's writing more than 2 paragraphs, that he needs additional time to complete tasks. There are 2 statements above that show that the student needs some additional time, and he needs checks for understanding. Now, again, we're going to see how that relates down below, that everything has to go back up to the present levels and to the goal. For the management needs, these are some areas that are specific for this student. We stated above that he needs a graphic organizer. Actually, above we stated that he does better when he uses a graphic organizer for writing assignments. So we've put that into his management needs of he needs a graphic organizer, and we state for writing longer than 2 paragraphs. We also wrote that he needs verbal and nonverbal redirecting from the teacher when he's off task. And again, that's specific to this student. Next slide, please. So we've taken the present levels, we've aligned them to the academic and the management needs. And as you can see on this slide, we're aligning those needs and to the goal. So we have the present levels and the needs aligning to our reading goal. And I just put them right on top again so you can see I took them from above. So the reading goal in this case is, after reading an informational or narrative text, Alex will answer inferential questions, comprehension questions. And then we talk about the success, the criteria over 2 weeks. The work samples will be how we collect that information. It'll be scheduled weekly, and it'll be done by the special education staff. So now the key point I want to also point out in this goal is you could also put a number into this goal when you say Alex will answer, and you could put 4 inferential comprehension questions, 2 inferential comprehension questions. But when you do that, it's each time that you do the data collection, you must do 2 at a time or 4 comprehension questions. If you don't put a number in there, this allows you to do on, let's say, Monday, a comprehension question inferential, on Tuesday, another one, maybe a third on Thursday, but you're collecting it. You're not having to do 4 at a time. So it just gives you the option. You get to choose that based on your knowing the student and what the CSE team determines. Next slide. Thank you. So the last piece that we're looking at that the state wanted us as we went through this corrective action plan was they wanted to make sure that our supplemental aids and modifications, programs and accommodations matched our present levels of performance. And so all I did on this slide, and I'm not going to read all of them, is I wrote down all of the information in the present levels up above and the need statement that match with these supplementals. I'm going to go through them because there's also specifics of what should be in the supplementals as we write them for students. The first thing that the state, when I met with them, they were stating was that if they look at our locations, which is on the far right-hand part of this screen, and they look and they see that everything down along that side is identical and that the durations are identical and there's no differences from location, duration, and the period, that kind of throws a trigger to them that maybe these aren't specific and they start looking at them a little bit more closely. So we do have to get specific in what we do when we talk about the location, especially when it comes to whatever that service or modification is. So in this first one, we have extended time to complete the task. Now, we already identified up above in the present levels that, that he takes longer to process ideas, that he does better answering questions out loud, needs a little additional time or a heads up. So he needs that extended time to complete tasks. We're saying that it is across all academic settings requiring lengthy writing because we notice that for Alex, he struggles with his writing, especially when it's longer and it's 2 paragraphs or more. We do this throughout the day. That's appropriate because he's going to be writing maybe in English, maybe in science, maybe in social studies, and even in math. The key piece here is that when we look at this service delivery recommendation, that has to relate to how we are going to implement this service modification, not the why do we do it. That's what's described up above in those present levels. So here we have that when working with word problems in math, because the other part of the present levels were under math where he needed some additional time with word problems, but also writing assignments in core classes of more than 2 paragraphs, Alex requires additional time, 1.5 times the amount for other students. So we're right here, we're saying how we're going to implement this and when are we going to do it? Whenever there's more than 2 paragraphs, we're going to give them that additional time. The next piece here I have is refocusing and redirection. Again, this is across all academic settings. It would make sense that a child that has some refocusing issues would happen in all settings throughout the day. And again, the service delivery recommendation is stated in a how are we going to be doing this? The teacher is to use verbal and nonverbal cues when the student is off task and ask questions of where the student is if he needs clarification. So this is telling you this is what the teacher is going to do in this instance. Ask questions of the student, give some nonverbal and verbal cues. We know up above in our present levels that he responds well when he's redirected by the teacher for that. So that would make sense to put in there. The next one is checks for understanding. And again, we look at across all academic settings throughout the school day. And the delivery recommendation, again, is worded in a how. And this is after every step, the teacher will check for understanding by asking reverent questions. For directions, Alex will restate the directions to the teacher when asked. So this is a strategy I've seen teachers use all the time. They talk to the class, they give directions, and they ask for feedback or somebody to restate the directions or tell everybody what to do. This would be something that Alex would need, and that may be the individual the teacher calls on. And then the last example that I have here would be additional wait time to express ideas. And again, up above, we talked about if you gave Alex a heads up that you're going to call on him and you gave him maybe the question you were going to ask, he would have a little bit more time to process and respond to that. And in this case, we put Alex needs additional time to process information and generate responses verbally, up to 20 seconds of wait time. So the teacher should also prepare the student in advance when they are going to call on him for a question. These are all specific to this student. Now, the one thing we want to be careful about when we look at our supplemental aids and services is that we don't just load this up with good teaching strategies. There's a lot of things that teachers are doing on a regular basis within their classrooms, which would be things like repeating the directions, giving wait time, checking for understanding. And so if it's a good teaching strategy, you don't need to put it in here unless it is very specific to the student. And then maybe in this case with Alex, he's off task every minute or so, or every 5 minutes. And so you need to redirect him, where other students might be off task maybe half the time when they're in the class, every 15 minutes, 20 minutes, etc. So you want to make it specific to that student's needs, and good teaching strategies don't always have to be listed in here. Okay, next slide, please. And this was the last area that the state review focused on. And I'm asking all teachers to kind of take a look at this, even though you may not be the one that writes this statement. I'm going to ask that as you prepare for your annual reviews and your reevals, that you take a look at this effective need of the student, because the state was very specific about this being how the student's disability affects their involvement and their progress in the general education curriculum. And for preschool students, the effect of the students' needs on participation in appropriate activities. So when we looked at this, we know that sometimes we have students that start off as a speech and language student, and that's their disability. And so that's the first statement that is written, is about their speech and language. But over the years, we may find out that it's more of a learning disability. And so that statement doesn't necessarily fit anymore. And we were not really writing them specifically to the general education curriculum. We were kind of broad statements about the student's disability. So in this case, I just want to point out some specifics that I put in this effective student needs. And what I ask that you do is when you're at the CSE meeting or prior, that you bring this up and have a discussion about how that student's disability really impacts them. So just in this case, we have that Alex's ADHD manifests itself through inattentiveness, high distractibility, and hyperactivity, which that is, many of our students have when they have ADHD. But here's the specific piece that the state is asking for. How does it impact the student? And it affects his ability to, and these are the key pieces, focus in class, complete writing assignments, his inability to answer questions out loud or follow multiple steps. You don't have to go into real specific details, but these are the general ways that it impacts the student. And then the last piece of it is it has to be focused on these behaviors having a negative impact on his involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. So it's really about the gen ed curriculum, not across all settings, not across the school day. It really has to be the focus of the general ed curriculum. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know this is a lot of information to give you up front, but I know that it's going to be developed as we go. The last thing I want to do is I just want to talk about where we think CEQA is going to be going or looking at next. And right now we are, again, under technical assistance, moving into a review process for the evaluation process that we do within the district. And they are looking at our initials and our reevals and how we determine those evaluations. And so many of you have worked with your ADs in the building and you've seen the referral form that comes out and you've been asked to put information into that referral form. And it's because we have to show the state how we are determining what evaluations we're using. We have to show the state the parents' involvement and the contact regarding those evaluations. So it can't just be the team deciding it, it has to be the parents' input as well. We have to show that we've reviewed or collected data prior to the meeting and that we've looked at intervention data, intervention data prior to the referrals. And we have to show that those evaluations that were done have been discussed at CSEs. The last piece I'm going to talk about right now, until maybe I join in later, is progress monitoring. So we think that the next step may be that if they start pulling some IEPs and they look at this and they say, hey, look, you've got some great statements in here. You've got good alignment with your data. Can you show us how you're collecting the data? Can you show us what staff are using when they document this? So we think that that may be coming from them looking at our progress monitoring and the statements that we do 4 times a year based on the goals. So what we want to see in those goals is we want to make sure that the progress monitoring has a data statement in each one of the sections of every one of the goals. So all of the goals need to have a comment, and all of the goals need to have data attached in that comment stating where the student currently is. It has to align to the goal because the goal needs to be measurable and observable. And lastly, the lack of attendance piece. I've had a lot of people ask me about this. How do we document that? How do we put that into our present, into our progress monitoring? How do we add that into our present levels? And basically what we have to do for that is we should be stating what the issues are. If we know it's related to the student's disability, we should be talking about how their disability is impacting their attendance. And then in addition to that, we can put data in there that says how many days out of the year the student's been absent. We can put measures, and we should be documenting measures of how we are contacting and reaching the parents in the contact log and in PowerSchool. But in the goals themselves or the progress monitoring, we can put in there that the student has been absent, but we still need to show data as to where the student is. And that may be the last measurement you have. It may be the measurement if the student hasn't been in school for that whole first marking period. It may be data from the previous year. So those are the areas we think they're going. Would like to keep that from happening. We don't want them to come in and do another cap for any buildings or for the district. So we're trying to work with everybody and get out to the buildings and describe this. And today's training goes hand in hand with what the state has been looking at for us so far. So that's going to end my piece of this. And I'm going to have Shannon jump back to you. I think that's all we have for me. And I'll be here to answer questions or jump in if we have any questions.
Great, thank you, Jean. So welcome, everyone. I'll say that again. We really appreciate your participation today. We know that was a lot of information, and we hope to spend the next several slides really breaking it down for you so that it can be very easy as you look to prepare for the rest of the CSEs for this year and for next year. So we're going to spend the first part of this next piece really breaking down some of the things that we're still noticing as it relates to the information that was shared as a part of Data-Driven Part One and Data-Driven Part Two.
Shannon, as you transition to that next slide, I do just want to add that, as Shannon said, this is lots of information. We're working together. There's lots of individual things we can do to support you if you're feeling like you're having more questions than we'll go through today. But you do have all of the presentation materials in your email now. So if you check your email, you'd like to get a copy of the presentation, you can click right into it and follow along with us. You can view it at a later time. And we've also included a link for a parking lot for us. So if you have a question, there's a form that you can submit your question that will come right to us so that we can get back to you with a response.
Thanks, Amy. So Data-Driven Part One really took us to the beginning of our work in looking at how we collect data to really develop those present levels of performance. And then as Amy shared earlier, Data-Driven Part Two really took us to the IEP goals and how we take that data and really develop a goal that is supportive of where that student is in their baseline data and where we need them to go in order to access the general education curriculum. What I've shared here for you on this slide really kind of encompasses everything that Jean shared as it relates to the IEP really needing to be a fluid document that weaves within each other. As a CSE chairperson, part of my role is to ensure that that IEP speaks to the present levels of performance and really aligns to the goals. And then today, as you'll see, the supplementary aids and accommodations. So really looking, as I look at my documents in preparation for CSE, I usually start with the end of the IEP. And I look at the goals and I look at the supplementary aids. And this is a really nice strategy for you as the IEP writer to think about as you're developing that student's IEP. What are they missing? What do they need in order to access that general education curriculum? Or where are the areas of skill deficit that we need to recover in order for them to make progress? So as I review a document for a CSE meeting, beginning with the end of the IEP and really looking at all of those components, the special transportation, testing accommodations, supplementary aids, what related services they have, the goals, management needs, and how that aligns to the present level of performance. Are these things noted as I read what the student can currently do? Another component from our earlier series that we want to reiterate as we move forward is the need for that baseline data. And I think that Jean really did a nice job of explaining that and reminding everyone that our IEP goals really need to be grounded in that data. It should be a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data, okay? I think that from our earlier trainings, we have seen coming to CSE lots of data that is in numerical form, right? It's that quantitative data. And at times we've lost that qualitative data that we know that we need in order to really accurately develop those present levels of performance to really speak to what that whole child can do. So we just wanted to draw your attention back to the fact that data is both facts or information that is used to calculate, analyze, or plan something, okay? So it can be that that student is able to read 10 CVC words out of 30 given. Okay, that's a numerical form of data. That's your quantitative data. But another data source that could be included in your present levels of performance are that student is not able to read grade level text without the support of an adult. They are not able to answer grade level literal comprehension questions. Those are data pieces that do not necessarily need a quantity attached to them, but are relevant as we talk about what that student can or cannot do. Another piece as we look back to Data-Driven Part One and Data-Driven Part Two that we continue to have a lot of questions around is how to align that data to that goal. And there's two kind of schools of thought, and it kind of just depends on how your brain thinks about things. So first option is you start with your data that you already have. So maybe you've done the emergent literacy screener and you know that your student is only reading 2 out of 26 capital letters, okay? So you may know, right? You know that you need them to be able to read all of their letters by that end of that IEP, okay? So your goal is where they currently are at, they're only reading 2, but by the end of this, I need them reading all 26 letters, okay? So you could start with the data that you already have, or you can start with what you know that student needs and create an assessment. And I think that we've heard from teachers at CSE that this is offered, kind of an area of stress. And these assessments can be very simple. Okay, so if you're trying to see if a student is able to write their name, you can very easily create a teacher assessment where you simply ask that student, please write your first and last name and note their progress accordingly. If you need help creating assessments, there's a lot of great tools that we have as a district that are already created, and they have been shared in previous trainings, and we can continue to share those. And then there's also great tools that our ELA and our math department has also shared that can be used. But these assessments don't have to be anything crazy. They can be little assessments that we create, and honestly, as we shared before, are the most meaningful assessments, the ones that we create to really assess a specific area that we know we need to understand and report out on for that student's IEP. So these are two kind of examples here. And what I hope that you'll take away from this, and this is something that you're going to want to keep as an easy reference, and Amy did say that she did share this presentation with you. This really speaks to the qualitative need for that data in the present levels of performance, as well as the quantitative data that's needed. So I'm going to read these to you. Alexis actively participates in ELA with the exception of a read aloud. Alexis is unable to read grade level text independently. Therefore, all grade level text is read aloud to her. When content vocabulary is pre-taught, Alexis presents a greater understanding of the text, read as evidenced by her literal comprehension skills. To continue to increase her decoding and fluency, Alexis needs visual cues for short vowel sounds when decoding CVC words. And it's explained in there what that means. Short A, short E, and repeated. Explicit instruction for word patterns yet to be mastered to increase her informational comprehension. Alexis needs modeling of metacognitive strategies and defined steps to generate an accurate response. She prefers to work in small groups. So nothing represented here with a numerical number, right? It's all qualitative. It's information about that student. Quantitative. Alexis is currently reading at a kindergarten level based on her most recent running reading record. Her iReady data places her at a lexile of 135, which is also a kindergarten level. She can identify Dolch pre-primer sight words with 30% accuracy. And when presented with CVC words in print, Alexis can decode them with 60% accuracy. However, when answer choices are provided, Alexis can decode the CVC words with 70% accuracy. Alexis is unable to decode words with CVC, CVCE, and other various patterns at 0%. So if we take what we wrote for the qualitative and the quantitative, we have a really good present level of performance that really describes that child through and through. The goal that was selected here, when presented with 10 words containing a mix of CVC, CCVC, and CVCE patterns, Alexis will decode and read the words with 80% accuracy. So I just want to note that the accuracy was chosen based on where she's currently at. Okay, the criteria is 80%. The period is 4 weeks. We're going to assess this using teacher created worksheets and tests, and we're going to assess this weekly in order to inform our work. So this is going to be kind of like your little checklist for understanding. Okay, so as you're working on your IEPs, thinking about, do I have baseline data statements in the PLEP that matches what the students can currently do in regards to each goal? Does my criteria match the goal? So for example, if the goal says a student will answer 5 questions, but the criteria is 85%, 4 out of 5 equals 80, right? So it has to make sense. If we want them to answer 5 questions, then it should be 100%. If we're only looking for that 80%, then it really should be 4 out of 5 questions. So it all should make sense. Does the present levels of performance tell me what the student can currently do overall, as well as what they can do in regards to the stated goals? And does the present level of performance define what the student needs to achieve at their current level and why? So for example, if graphic organizers are needed for writing to accommodate sequencing and organizational deficits, it should be embedded into that present level of performance. So what we wanted to remind you here on this slide is, like Amy shared, she sent out the presentation. I'm sure your brain is flooding with questions right now. There is a link on your slide, and I know Amy also included it in the email, so you can easily click on it. And that's just a place where you can send us questions. We want to remind you that just like we've done with all of our trainings, we will follow up after this training with a frequently asked questions to answer any of these parking lot questions that we feel need to be addressed in order to help you guys and to really improve our work.
Shannon, while we're pausing for that parking lot slide, I will jump in and say that if you did not receive the email from me, it's probably because you're not on the specialized services listserv that I have that is identified by your job code. So if you are having a hard time accessing it, please send me an email and I will make sure that you get the parking lot and the presentation and whatever else you might need. Thank you.
All right, so we've heard the feedback from CEQA. We talked about just some things to continue to think about from our first couple trainings. And now we're ready to move into some newer information, okay, which hopefully will summarize a lot of what Jean shared as the feedback. But I honestly hope this isn't new information, because I know as a CSE chairperson, this is stuff that we've been receiving a lot of training around and that we are continuing to work through at that CSE table. So I hope some of this sounds very familiar to you. So we just wanted to ground some of our work moving forward in what IDEA says. So supplementary aids and services means that the aids and services and other supports that are provided in regular education classes, other educational related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent and a maximum appropriate in accordance with Part 200 regulations. So I just want to remind everybody that the reason why we put supplementary aids and accommodations on the IEP is really to level that playing field. These are the components, and I hope this word's going to sound familiar, the specially designed instructional strategies that the students need in order to really access that general education curriculum. And it's beyond best practice. It is really specific to that student. And it should be so specific that you could read it and do it, even if you don't regularly work with that child. So this should also be a reminder from our SDI trainings that we did last year. The supplementary aids and services, those are the things that we do to support. They are there to support the student, to give them that access to that least restrictive environment. So as we think about students in our most least restrictive programs, our consult students, our integrated students, those are students where you may see more supplementary aids and services, because that's what we're using in order to give them access to that general education curriculum. The accommodations are things that we do to adjust, right? That's the adjustments to the environment, the instruction, or those materials that allow a student equal access to learning and demonstrating what they have learned according to the general education curriculum. Okay, so accommodations are definitely, though, different than program modifications. Modifications, when you think about the word modification, you are changing something. It's what you're changing. It could be what you're changing that the student is actually going to do as a result of their learning. We tend to see program modifications on students that are alternatively assessed, because we are modifying their curriculum, their assignments, to actually adjust what they are demonstrating as their output. We're changing what they are going to do. Okay, so those program modifications, as we've shared in earlier trainings, should really be reserved for NYSED, GEM, and those programs where students are alternatively assessed. The majority of you today work with students that have a lot of accommodations. And those are just those adjustments to the environment, instruction, or materials. So we wanted to give you some examples. And one of those examples for supplementary aids and services could be a note taker, additional transition time. This term is often used interchangeably with an accommodation. Accommodations could also be additional time to complete writing tasks, fewer items on a page, copies of steps to solve multi-step problems. And then program modifications could be reducing the number of standards that a student's going to be assessed at, alternative assessment, curriculum, and or grading system. And I'm going to turn the next part of this presentation over to Shannon D'Agostino.
Just change the slide for me, please. Thank you. So one of the things that can often come up is the difference between an accommodation modification and then an intervention. So when we consider interventions, sometimes what we do as far as a student intervention is an accommodation. We're going to give them small group instruction, extra practice. We're going to incorporate some of those best teaching. We're going to provide visuals. But when we consider interventions, they are for all students. Right? So an intervention is something that any student can qualify for. It's temporary and it's targeted on a specific skill that's going to remediate a deficit, right? So when we consider accommodations, They can be similar to some of the things that we do for intervention, but it is only available for some students. And for those some students, they have to be a student with a disability. So, multiplication charts, copy of class notes, those are things that you as a teacher can provide for your whole class. But an accommodation is something that is for a student with disability. Modifications are even fewer. So we go from all of our students to some of our students, those some are classified. Our classified students, even fewer of them are going to receive modifications, because that is where we're going to change that curriculum measurement of learning. We've reduced the rigor, and they are no longer achieving at the same level as their gen ed peers. So that is kind of the difference between all of this. And a key thing to always remember is that special ed is not instead of interventions. Our students with disabilities still qualify for interventions if that is what they need. Another thing to consider is that specially designed instruction. When we are looking at the supplementary aid supports, program accommodations, modifications, when we're thinking of those things, I want everyone, when you're writing your IEP, to consider what are you doing in the classroom. So when we talk about SDI, we're really talking about what the teacher does. So you've given us that quantitative data, those numbers, right? But I want you to share, what are you doing to bring that grade level instruction to the student based on their needs? So when we consider something like explicit instruction on how to use a graphic organizer, that's what you do as the educator to bring that access to the student. And then possibly that supplementary aid and service modification accommodation could be the graphic organizer. Multisensory teaching strategies, explicit instruction in the writing process. So if we're going to give the student a writing process checklist, right, that's an accommodation that we're going to provide them, maybe that's a given in their goal, we want to make sure that we talk about what we do, which is that explicit instruction in the writing process. We're not just going to hand it to them and assume that they know how to use that. And I think that you all do these things every day in your work. We're just not really good about giving ourselves credit when we're writing the IEPs and documenting all of the things that we do, because it's such second nature to us. So we really need to make sure that we are being explicit in what we're doing in the classroom to bridge that access. A student might need calming strategies or access to a calming corner, but we want to make sure that we're teaching and practicing those calming strategies, teaching and practicing how to use those supplementary aids and supports as it's listed in the IEP. So just something to consider when writing your PLEP, that we're really going to define what it is that we are doing as well to bring that access to grade level. The other part, I think, where we can get a little muddy is the management needs versus the supplementary aid services, accommodations, and modifications. So when we consider that management need, this is what the student needs in order to learn in the least restrictive environment, having access to that general ed curriculum. It is based on environmental, human, and material resources. We don't need to define them that way, right? So when you are completing that management needs section, it does not need to say environmental and then a list. We don't have to divide them that way. We just know that anything that we are doing in our environment, anything that you are doing or your support staff are doing, or a nurse, anything that's being done as a human, and then all of those material resources are listed there. We want to make sure that we are defining these in the present levels, and that includes the social and physical present levels. So if the student needs break passes, they need calming corner, they need, someone to check in with them in the morning to do like an emotional check-in, those kinds of things. If they need pencil grips, they need specialized paper to write per OT, right? All of that can also be included in the management needs section, because this is also what the student needs. And we want to make sure that we are including some of those components of the program. So a question that has come up frequently is, I have, an ASD classroom, part of my tier 1 is everyone gets a visual schedule. That's just part of an ASD classroom. So when you're considering that, if the student uses that visual schedule, even though it's provided to all of your kids, you can still put it on there. If it's something that your student, if you took away that visual schedule tomorrow and they would still be okay with it, then you don't need to list it. So that's kind of where we're teasing out what should be in that section. When we take those management needs and we consider that supplementary aid, support, accommodation, and modification section, that's really where we're going to define how, when, where this specific need is going to be addressed for this individual student. We're defining the why in the present levels. We're listing it in the management needs. And then we put it here as long as it is specific to an individual student. So anything that we would consider as needed, we're not going to list it in this section. So if student needs breaks as needed, and it's not on a very finite schedule, then we can put it in the management needs that the student, when frustrated, the student needs, a break within the classroom, right? But if we are putting it in the supplementary aid, service, accommodation, modification section, we want to really explicitly say, how we're doing that. How does that look for this student? So anything that we just do for all kids and this student uses management needs, supplementary aids and supports is what you do for this individual. It's not for all students. When we're determining what we're going to list in this section, we really want to first start with that access. What does the student need to access the general education from the present levels? In the present levels, I've said that they can do this, they can do this, and they can do this. None of it's really on grade level. So what are you doing then to bridge that grade level? Those are going to be listed. From there, did you put it in the management needs section? Yes, I did. So now it's in the management needs section. Does it need more specificity? Is it beyond as needed for this student? So do they need a graphic organizer with lines pre-put on it because they cannot, they can't write in those big open spaces. So it needs to have lines and it needs to be provided anytime the student is writing something longer than a short response. Then you can add it to that section. Right. So those are just some of the things to consider. We put it in the PLEP, it's in the management needs section, but this student needs it beyond. It needs to be super specified. So I always like to give an example. I think it's helpful to see that. So if I look down and this is all defined in my PLEPs already, and now I've got my management needs listed, the student's going to get preferential seating. They need a structured environment with expectations, visual models, support with transitions. So those are all listed, but I know for this particular student, support with transitions, what does that mean? So the frequency will be always in that C delivery recommendations, and that statement's going to say this student requires a 3-minute prompt followed by a 1-minute prompt prior to the transition in and out of the classroom. So that is very specific for this student. So they don't necessarily need these prompts to change from one activity to another within the classroom. It's really when they're transitioning outside of, oh no, I did say in and out. So in the classroom, out of the classroom, it's something that they need every single day during transitional time. So it's very explicit that anyone coming into this classroom can look at the student's IEP and know that that is what they need. The PE teacher can see this listed out and say, okay, I know in PE, I've got to do a 3-minute prompt. I've got to do a 1-minute prompt. It has to be done in art everywhere the student goes. Preferential seating, the student requires a seat where there are no peers behind him to reduce anxiety and increase focus. Oftentimes preferential seating, we assume it's close to the instructor, right? Or it's close to an adult. For some of our students, it's not the front of the room. They need to have no one behind them. So this is something that's very specific for this student. Another visual to kind of help us streamline what this looks like. So that present level of performance, we're stating what the student needs and why they need it. In the management needs, we're going to state kind of what they need again. We're going to restate it. It is redundant, and when they need it. And then that supplementary aid support program modification accommodation, we're only going to restate the needs that are so individualized. They need an explicit explanation of how it's needed. So again, this always goes back to the PLEPs, right? So the PLEPs really define and justify every other component of the IEP. So it's got to be in the PLEPs. We're going to restate it in the management needs if that is what they need. And then we're going to put it in that last section only if it needs to be specified for that individual student and really explained how it's needed. There's nothing that says you need to have X number of management needs or X number of supplementary aid supports. It's not really a numbers thing. It's really what the student needs. However, anything that's listed on those bottom two should be represented up in the PLEPs. And if you have something that is a supplementary aid support modification accommodation, it should be in the management needs and the PLEPs as well. The management needs and the supplementary aids and supports, they don't need to match, right? You don't need to have everything listed that's a management need, does not also need to be listed as an accommodation, but anything that's listed as an accommodation should be up above. So how does this all fit together, right? We have those instructional best practices, and I think as special educators, again, this comes so naturally to us, you know, that universal design, differentiation, explicit instruction. These are things that you do all day, every day in your classrooms. And sometimes it's hard to take those best practices and really spell them out. But that is where that specially designed instruction piece comes in, and it connects to all pieces of the IEP. So the assistive technology, modifications, accommodations, support for school personnel, testing accommodations, all of these things connect into that specially designed instruction, which we outline in our PLEPs. So testing accommodations is another component of the IEP that we don't always consider when we're writing our PLEPs. Shannon's slide. Thank you. So by definition, our testing accommodations are changes to the format of a test or its administration procedures. Testing accommodations change how the student is tested, but not what the test measures. So a student with disability that's receiving these accommodations are still required to take the same assessment and reach the same level of proficiency as students who do not have a disability, but these accommodations provide them that access, right? We are taking the barriers of the disability and we are providing accommodations around those barriers. So with that being said, when we're considering, you know, what testing accommodations a student may need, what do they need to access, you know, the same assessment? What is it that they would need in order to sit through this test that their general ed peers have to also sit through and don't have a disability? Can you define what that looks like for this student? So if you think that the student really needs breaks throughout the testing, we need to consider what that looks like. Do they need a break every 10 minutes, every 30 minutes, right? What does that look like? How long is the break? Do they need 2 minutes? Do they need 8 minutes? So is it a movement break? Is it just a mind break? Could it be either? We really want to make sure that we're defining what that break looks like. And is it based on the student's disability, right? We always have to make sure that we are checking with that piece. We can't just give them to give them. It really should be based on the student's disability. And then is there evidence of these needs in the PLEP? So if I'm in a CSE and I go down to that testing accommodation and there's 6 things listed and none of those things are evidenced up in the PLEP, we have to put it there. This cannot be the first place that we see that this student needs direction simplified, that this student needs test read. All of this should already be evidenced in the PLEP as needs, because if they need it for a test, they probably need it in the classroom. Same thing with special transportation. It is, again, one of those pieces that kind of pops up on the IEP. Most likely, if it's not initial, it's either there or it's not there. You as the new writer have not put that there, but we want to take a look at special transportation as well. So again, by definition, this is for a student with disability to and from school whose disability prevents them from using the same transportation as their non-disabled peer. Most students with disabilities can and should receive the same transportation provided to non-disabled students consistent with the LRE, right? So when we consider that least restrictive environment, it also applies to our transportation. So when we're thinking about it, we want to consider the needs of the student related to their disability and also that are also reflected in the PLEPs. So you cannot have something on the transportation, all of a sudden, the student needs a harness, but we have not talked anywhere in the PLEPs about the student being physically unsafe. So even if it's only on the bus, we want to make sure that we have that somewhere in the PLEPs. So for example, adult supervision, right? That's what the student has listed for special transportation. Somewhere in the PLEPs, probably the social PLEP, due to the student's impulsivity and need to escape situations as evidenced on his FBA, CASH requires adult supervision during transitions in and out of the school. So we're not cutting and pasting student needs adult supervision for special transportation. We're not saying it like that. We're making it a natural statement that flows into the IEP. Again, considering the disability related special transportation, it should be based on mobility, behavior, communication, developmental, physical, and medical needs. And they should also be described in the PLEPs. You should not see that the student needs, an adult supervision on the bus because they have seizures, and that's the only place on the entire IEP that this is listed. So again, if it's a need, it should be a need all the way through. Special transportation is not appropriate for non-disability based reasons. As educators, this is a hard piece, right? This is where it gets a little hard. We know that the student's not coming to school because of X, Y, and Z. It has to do with transportation. Can't we just give it to them? Unfortunately, this is another area where CEQA is really, kind of checking in, and it has to be disability based, and it should be disability based. So parent or committee's perception of the neighborhood, right? It's not safe. The parent doesn't have a vehicle. So they need, a bus to pick the student up at their house because, they need that accommodation. We want to work around the student's schedule, inclement weather kind of things. We need to make sure that it is based on the student's disability, and we have evidenced it in the IEP. And then just considering some effectiveness, when we get that draft open and we sit down to write a new IEP, we really want to consider what the student needs and kind of ask ourselves, is this an accommodation that the student definitely used consistently? Did it give them access? Were they able to demonstrate their learning because of this? Did it allow the student to feel like a member of the class, or was it such an extreme accommodation that it really didn't support that? Does the student like using it? If you've got weighted vests on the IEP and it says that, the student should have this and it's in the management needs, and we've got it listed that, at this time of day, the student is going to wear, a weighted vest and it's documented and the student hates it, can we consider taking that off and putting something that will address the similar need, but is a different accommodation? And then does that accommodation support growth and or progress for that student? So those are just some considerations, as you look through the IEP. If the student doesn't use it, you can take that off, right? You don't have to wait for the meeting to take it off. If you already know that this is something the student doesn't need, maybe they've matured, maybe it's just a different environment. There's lots of things that can contribute to, the student's needs changing a little bit. So feel free to go ahead and make this, your new IEP very relevant to what the student needs for the next 364 days. So there are some resources embedded in this PD, and they're really around those accommodations and modifications, and they're presented in two different ways. I know that we all, when you're writing an IEP, you may think of things differently. So they're just presented in two different ways. Some of them are similar, but it just allows you, if you've got a student and you're struggling to think of some behavior needs, those common accommodations by type, click on that and you can scroll through and it'll break it down, based on the need of the student and the type of accommodations, and it'll give you some suggestions for that. The specially designed instruction will help you take those needs that that the student has and then kind of connect the SDI to it so that you can incorporate it into your PLEP. And then of course we've included the New York State annotated IEP so that, if you get stuck and you're not really sure what goes in this section, you have that to look at and refer to. And that is the end of what we have.
Thank you, Shannon. I know that Shannon and Jean are going to jump back in. I definitely want to give them an opportunity to close us up as we are ending close to the end of our time today. But before we log off, I will give some instructions on the survey for this session. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jean and Shannon for their closing comments, and then we'll go back to me for the survey to close our session.
So Gina, I'll say first, we know this is a big lift. It requires a lot of support from you guys. Obviously, you guys are the ones writing the IEP, and we're there to kind of support you as you need help with that process. So we just want to remind you that as you continue to have questions, as you continue to need support, and I think Jean will also echo the fact that the feedback changes and it gets a little clearer each time we do a submission and get some more coaching from the state. So you'll see some future presentations probably that adjust some of our messages and really, really define it a little bit more. So as you have questions, as you need support, please reach out to us. We do have some teachers on special assignment who are able to, provide some feedback as you need help in coaching and developing students' IEPs. And then your associate director is always there just to help and support. So always reach out to them as well. Jean, did you want to share any other information?
The only thing that I wanted to share is that, yes, it is a lot. It is a big lift. And I think the more we go over, the more we see this and we work together, we'll be able to get through it and meet the expectations of the state. The other piece I just mentioned is that I will still be coming out to each of the buildings. First, I'm doing all of the CAP buildings, but I have been going out to buildings that are not under the corrective action plan and going into a little bit more detail of just that alignment piece. So talk with your AD and your principal, and I'll be willing to come out to the buildings if they need a refresher or if they need me to go over any information.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Shannon. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks all of you who have attended this session. I want to encourage you to go back in to that parking lot link, ask your specific question about the situation that you're currently in, about maybe an IEP that you're specifically working on, that you would like some feedback or have a question about. We will get back to you if you do enter that question into our Google form. I have been actively trying to send out as many links as I could during the presentation. I also have links in my away message if you were still looking for either the presentation, also a link to the parking lot, or if you have any other questions, please reach out. I do want to make sure that I share that you must complete a survey at the end of the day today, at the end of Superintendent's Conference Day, to verify your attendance and also to receive your state certification credit for today. So what you'll need to do is go back and visit the Superintendent's Conference Day landing page that the Office of Communications and Office of Professional Learning have sent out. So please go back to that website and you will find a link to that Google survey. You'll click on the link to that survey and you'll enter your information, including your name and your email address and your employee ID, also your work location. And then you'll have to select which session you attended, and you will want to make sure that you're selecting the mandatory special education workshop on data-driven IEP development. So that's the link that you'll click to make sure that you get attendance for today's session. I know that it's probably not live until the very end of the day, as many sessions are continuing to occur. And we do have a second session that's coming up for related service providers and psychologists later this afternoon. So just want to make sure you are reminded that you do need to go and do that survey to get verification of your attendance. I know some of you are asking. So I appreciate your captive attention this morning, and please reach out if we can assist you with IEP development. Sure.